There is a moment you can't quite name when you realize the person sitting across from you has become a stranger. Not in the dramatic way, no betrayal, no fight, no clear ending. Just a quiet, creeping awareness that the conversations don't land the same way anymore. You still care? You still remember who they were to you, what you built together, the versions of yourselves that once fit perfectly. But something fundamental has shifted, and pretending otherwise feels exhausting. You find yourself editing your words, holding back pieces of who you've become because you know they won't understand. The inside jokes feel hollow. The routines you once cherished now feel obligatory. You sit together in silence that used to feel comfortable, but now presses heavy between you, filled with everything you're not saying. And beneath it all runs a thread of guilt so persistent you can barely breathe, because how do you mourn someone who is still alive? How do you grieve a relationship that technically still exists? Here lies the paradox that breaks you quietly. Loving someone and outgrowing them aren't oppositions. They can coexist, tender and terrible, in the same breath. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for a relationship is to let it change or let it go. This story doesn't always begin in childhood. Sometimes it begins in the middle of your life. When you look around and realize you're no longer the person you were when these connections formed, you've evolved not because something was broken, but because that's what living does. It reshapes you, slowly and constantly, until one day you look in the mirror and recognize someone new. Identity development doesn't stop after adolescence, though we're often taught it should. In truth, emerging adulthood and the decades that follow are marked by continuous transformation shifts in values, priorities, beliefs, and the very core of who we understand ourselves to be. When you change at your foundation, your relationships either grow with you or remain anchored to who you used to be. And when someone keeps relating to a version of you that no longer exists, the disconnection becomes inevitable. Two psychological forces drive this experience. The first is identity resolution, the ongoing process of clarifying who you are, what matters to you, and what kind of life reflects your authentic self. As you develop greater self-understanding, you naturally seek relationships that mirror your values and depth. The second is relational misalignment. When the trajectories of two people diverge so significantly that the relationship can no longer hold both without one person shrinking or pretending. Picture a friendship that formed in your 20s, built on late nights and shared chaos. You bonded over uncertainty, over figuring life out together, over dreams that felt infinite. But now you're in your 30s, and you've found clarity about your work, your boundaries, what you'll tolerate and what you won't. You're still where you were, cycling through the same patterns, asking the same questions. You try to meet them there. But it feels like reaching backward into a life you've already lived. Recall a relationship where you became the version of yourself they needed. Smaller, quieter, less complicated. You learned not to share your wins too loudly, your growth too visibly, because it created distance. You translated your thoughts into language they could receive, edited your enthusiasm, dimmed your evolution. And slowly, invisibly, you began to disappear. Imagine conversations that used to energize you but now leave you drained. You give and give, listening, supporting, holding space, but there's no reciprocity. You realize the relationship has become one-sided, sustained by your effort alone. You're not angry, you're tired. And that exhaustion whispers a truth you don't want to hear. This isn't working anymore. See yourself pulling away, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. You stop sharing the parts of your life that matter most because you know they woe and be met with curiosity or celebration. The silence isn't hostile, it's protective. You're creating distance because staying close requires betraying yourself. These moments accumulate quietly, building an architecture of disconnection so subtle you barely notice it. Until you're re-standing on opposite sides of a chasm you never intended to create, the disconnection shows itself in small, undeniable ways. You maintain the relationship out of loyalty to who you used to be together, not who you are now. The history binds you, shared memories, inside jokes that no longer land, rituals that feel more like obligation than joy. You show up because you always have. Because walking away from years of connection feels impossible to justify when there's no clear villain, no betrayal to point to. Guilt becomes your constant companion. You feel guilty for wanting more and more depth, more growth. more authenticity, as if your evolution is somehow a betrayal of what you once shared. When you're with them, you perform a version of yourself that feels safe and familiar, even though it no longer fits. You laugh at the right times, nod at the right moments, but inside you're hollow, watching yourself pretend. The mask isn't malicious, it's protective. It keeps the peace, but it exhausts you. Your wins become secrets. You avoid telling them about the parts of your life that excite you most because you know they woe and understand or celebrate them. A promotion, a new passion, a shift in perspective that changed everything. These things stay locked inside you, shared only with people who can meet you there. Your growth feels like something to apologize for, evidence of how you've drifted rather than proof of who you're becoming. The contrast becomes stark when you spend time with newer connections, people who meet you at your current level, who don't require translation. With them, conversation flows. Silence feels comfortable. You don't edit yourself down or hold back pieces of your truth. The difference is so clear, it makes the misalignment with old relationships impossible to ignore. It's not that one group is better, it's that one reflects who you are now, and the other reflects who you were. Boundaries that once felt flexible now feel essential. Behavior you tolerated in the past, drama, manipulation, emotional imbalance grates against everything you've learned about healthy connection. Your standards have evolved, but the relationship hasn't kept pace. What you once accepted out of ignorance or loyalty now feels suffocating, and yet naming this feels cruel. How do you tell someone they no longer align with your values without sounding judgmental? So you stay silent, creating distance without explanation. You stop initiating. You let texts go unanswered a little longer. You decline invitations with vague excuses. The relationship doesn't end. It fades, slowly and quietly. Until one day you realize weeks have passed without contact, and neither of you reached out. The silence isn't hostile, it's simply ... easier. And beneath it all, you grieve. Not loudly, not publicly, but in private moments. When a song reminds you of who they used to be to you, when a memory surfaces unbidden and sweet, you mourn the closeness you once had while they're still physically present in your life, still reachable, still technically your friend. The loss is ambiguous, unnameable. How do you explain missing someone who's still here? How do you honor what was without pretending it still is? Still, the question haunts you. Are you being ungrateful? Selfish? Judgmental? You wonder if the problem is them, or whether you're growing, or just growing cold? But deep down you know the truth, heavy and undeniable. This isn't about superiority or judgment. It's about alignment. You've simply grown in different directions. And sometimes, no matter how much love remains, that's enough of a reason to let go. Here, healing begins with permission. Permission to change, to outgrow, to honor who you're becoming, even when it means leaving behind who you were. Outgrowing people doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for a relationship is to acknowledge when it no longer serves either of you. What if outgrowing isn't loss, but evolution? Not rejection, but redirection toward what reflects your truth. You're not abandoning people. You're making space for relationships that honor who you're becoming, not who you used to be. Growth isn't betrayal. You don't owe anyone stagnation to preserve their comfort. You're allowed to change, allowed to want more, allowed to prioritize your peace over someone else's expectations. The guilt you carry, that heavy, persistent voice telling you you're being selfish, isn't wisdom. It's conditioning. You've been taught that loyalty means staying, even when staying costs you pieces of yourself. But real loyalty includes loyalty to your own becoming. Honoring who you are now matters as much as honoring who you were then, maybe more. Not every connection requires a dramatic conclusion. Sometimes love transforms into distance, closeness into memory. You can honor what was without forcing it to continue beyond its natural lifespan. And recognizing when a season has ended doesn't diminish what you shared, it honors it by refusing to force it into something it's not. You can hold gratitude for the past and clarity about the present in the same breath. Let relationships end softly when they need to. A gentle fade isn't cowardice, sometimes it's mercy. Not every goodbye needs to be spoken. Not every ending needs explanation. You're allowed to simply drift. To let the space between you widen naturally, without guilt, without performance, without pretending closeness still exists when it doesn't. Seek people who grow with you, not despite you. The right relationships don't require you to shrink, translate, or apologize for your evolution. They expand with you, meeting your depth without asking you to dim it. These people exist not in the places where everyone goes, but in the corners where curiosity gathers, where questions are welcomed, where change is celebrated rather than feared. You'll know them by how they make you feel, seen, not tolerated, celebrated, not managed, free, not confined. Trust the discomfort. That persistent feeling that something is off, that's not confusion. That's clarity trying to reach you. Your intuition knows when a relationship no longer fits, even when your loyalty tries to override it. Listen to the quiet voice beneath the guilt. It's telling you the truth. Picture healing as a tree shedding leaves to make room for new growth. The shedding isn't violence, it's necessity. The tree doesn't apologize, doesn't question whether it's being ungrateful to the leaves that served it well. It simply releases what no longer serves its current season, trusting that this clearing makes space for what comes next. And so the truth settles. Bittersweet but freeing. Outgrowing people you love is not a failure of loyalty, it's evidence of growth. You're allowed to evolve beyond the relationships that no longer reflect who you are. You're allowed to choose connection that feels true over connection that feels familiar. Not emptiness, but space. It's not abandonment, but alignment. Not loss, but transformation. Let yourself become who you're meant to be, even when it means walking away from who you were. The right people will grow with you. And the ones who don't, you can love them from a distance, honoring what was without sacrificing what's becoming. You owe them kindness, but you owe yourself truth. And when those two things can no longer coexist in the same relationship, you're allowed to choose yourself, not emptiness, but peace. Not cruelty, but clarity. Not the end of love, but the beginning of loving yourself enough to let go.